Hey everybody, it's Jim from Cigars. You know, it's hard to believe, but a simple strip of paper, a cigar band, actually revolutionized the whole cigar business. So in this video, we're going to talk about how that came about and also how the cigar bands from way back evolved into the cigar bands that we see today. The story of cigar bands actually dates back to the early 1800s. And as we certainly know today, and it was true back then, cigars had differences in quality and construction and taste and so forth. But cigars weren't banded. There was no way of telling one cigar from another. So you might buy one cigar that you really liked and enjoyed, thought it was a great cigar, and you couldn't find it again because cigars weren't really branded. They were all kind of cigars sold a lot of times out of big barrels. So it was really difficult to impossible to differentiate one cigar from another. And that was a problem facing a guy by the name of Gustav Bock. And he was actually a Dutchman, but he had a cigar making operation in Cuba. And he was making cigars in Cuba to export back to Europe. And his problem was his cigars were very sought after. He made really good cigars, but people didn't know how to get them because there was no way to identify it. And counterfeiters were claiming they had Gustav Bock cigars. So just imagine there were counterfeits even back then. And he wanted some way to battle those counterfeits, so he came up with a simple solution of a plain white band, and he hand signed each and every one with his signature and put them on his cigars so people would know that those cigars were ones that he had made. So that happened in 1830. The cigar band idea really took off. It was very effective, obviously, and also really expensive, fractions of a penny to make a band back then. So the idea was picked up very quickly by another fellow who made cigars in Cuba, Ramone Allones. Ramone Allones is really credited with being one of the founding fathers of the cigar business in Cuba. So he really embraced the band idea after seeing how well it worked for Gustav Bock. And by 1850, almost all the cigars that were sold out of Cuba had bands on them. So that was really the beginning of banded cigars. But interestingly enough, the use of bands also coincided, and I think was a big force in driving the popularity of cigars from 1850 to about 1900 or so. That period represented immense growth for the cigar industry. In fact, I saw a claim that 4 out of 5 men in the US in 1900 smoked cigars. So it became very popular once people had the reassurance that they could buy a cigar and know that they could buy that same cigar again by the same maker and get relatively the same experience. So it's a little thing, honestly, that we take for granted today that we can tell one cigar from another. But back then it was really a big deal. And brands evolved over the years. They became more elaborate and then less elaborate. And they kind of went through phases in terms of what the popular style of art was for that particular time. But if you look at the bands today, really what you see is they've resolved the same issues that the bands back then did. One of them is brand identity, being able to rest assured that you're getting a product from a cigar maker that you trusted. And along the same thought pattern, counterfeiting. It's a good way to prevent counterfeiting. And as we know, the Cuban Cohiba brand spends a lot of time and energy and money on designing bands that are very difficult to be counterfeited, as do the Fuentes with Opus X. And if you look at an Opus X band, you'll see there's a lot of built-in features to make counterfeiting much more difficult. Another thing that modern bands do that actually old-time bands did not really accomplish is it's allowed cigar makers to spin off brands. So take, for example, La Aroma de Cuba. They do a really good job of making their bands tie together the Aroma de Cuba line, but each cigar, each type of La Aroma de Cuba has its own identity within that brand image. I'm showing a picture actually of some bands that do a very good job with that. Perdomo does a very good job, as do some of the Davidoff cigars, and Drew Estates with their Undercrown line also does a good job of really tying together the brand identity, but being able to tell each specific cigar by its band. Okay, that's kind of a quick history of cigar bands. And I got a couple of questions for you. I'd like to find out what you think. Do you have any favorite cigar bands? Which ones are your favorites that really stand out? Do you like simple cigar bands like the old Monte Cristo style and the original Padrones? Or do you like a more elaborate band like the full-length ones that Rocky Patel and other companies use? Also, do you save your bands? I have an old cigar box that I throw bands in if I think of it, and I built up a pretty good collection of them. But anyway, hope you enjoyed this video. I will see you next time from Cigars, Cigars, Cigars.